All right, so the first thing we're going to do today is a little warm-up exercise, and this is contour drawing. So I want you to hold up your hand and look away from the paper and don't pick up your pencil and just try to do all the shapes of your hand, all the lines, all the nails, all the little creases, but don't cheat and don't look at your paper. So contour drawing, this is what we're going to be doing throughout this class. And everything is going to be done in a 3-pass technique. So we start with doing this sort of scribbly contour drawing, and then we'll define our edges nicely, and then we'll come in with the ink. But anytime you go to art school, this is usually the first thing that they do when you're in your drawing class is a practice. And it's just to help you trust what you're feeling and to learn to really see the shapes. This way you're not drawing what you think is there, you're just going over all the outlines of what really is there. And when you're not looking at the paper, you end up with a really funny looking fat hand like this. Okay, so moving on, this is our subject, our first one, and we're going to learn a little bit of sight measuring. So when you're out in the field, you hold up your pencil and first start by marking the longest part of the subject. So everything else will be relative to that. So the next widest part is up here, and that's about half of the height. And then I divide it into the main parts, and those will give me my main targets that I want to try to hit. So here I'm going to mark my top, my edges, and the main little sections in there. And I'm going to do this whole thing in a really quick scribble drawing, going around the outsides, not picking up my pencil and not erasing anything, just keep moving. And once you have those measurements already laid out, then that should help with everything being relatively accurate. And remember, we're just focusing on the outside right now. We're going to do this process where we work from the outside in. That way you save a lot of time, because if you start doing all the little detail work right away, you might find that you are accidentally off the page, or that you're way off with something and you just spent several hours working on it and you have to erase the whole thing. This should save you a ton of time. So once you have got your scribbles on, then you start figuring out which are the main lines that look the best, and then you darken those and just concentrate on those areas. So here I've further defined the best marks. And in some areas I'm sort of exaggerating things, and I want to do this to give it a little bit more character so it's not too stiff and uptight. So now I've got my outside shape. Now I want to start putting in my shadow shapes. And I'm not just drawing little lines here, I'm coloring in the shadows. So these shadows give everything a nice sense of form and it starts to become 3D. And then for all those little details in the side there, I just kind of do some more sort of scribble drawing and your brain will translate that as being all the detail. And you can see on the left side, I leave a lot of that information off because that's where the sun is hitting it the most. And so by leaving that open and clear, it creates a nice highlight. You can tell where the sun is. And I also noticed my line needed to move over a little bit because it's not right in the center of the subject there. It's more of an angle off to the side. And then I'll even put in a little bit of foliage on the top, and I'll just do circles for the flowers and little scribble marks for the leaves. Now I got my main pencil lines down, so the next thing is start pulling in the ink. Now I use the old-fashioned dip pens. They're my favorite just because they add to that sense of looseness because of the lack of control, and they tend to break up more on their own and give you some interesting openings. But if you prefer to just use a regular pen, that's fine too, or a marker. Just make sure that whatever you're using is waterproof. So now with these blacks, what we want to do is create a really good sense of contrast. And then I usually stop with the ink once I feel like I have enough contrast and it's well balanced. So I get the ink really dark and thick in the really shadowy areas, and then I do looser scribble marks or draw lines with a little bit of a gap in between them to create softer amounts of shading. So here with the openings, you see it makes it look kind of like a gray, and then when you color it in all the way, then you got a nice deep black. And the same you can do with these little squiggle marks. The more open they are, it becomes more of a gray, and then when they're tighter and closed over, then it's a nice dark black. So I'm leaving off most of the information on that sunny side, and that creates that nice highlight. So I'm just adding little hints of details and not really overdrawing anything, but I want to get some really good deep darks up here where the flowers are so that I've got some very heavy contrast. All right, so now once I get my ink on, it's time to start playing with the color. And for this one, I'm using kind of natural colors, so I want the warm brown tones going over it. And then for the shadowy areas, I kind of add the blues and purples. The cool colors make really good shadows, and then the warmer colors do good for the sunny areas. So it's still wet, and I'm just dropping in some nice purples and blues now. And you can see what an extra um, sense of form that little bit of purple gives this. So here, I just finished dropping in my greens, and then I throw some more purples into the shadowy area, and that's about it for that sketch. So the next subject is this little English cottage, and this is going to be an elevation drawing. So that means we're looking straight on and we don't have any perspective lines to worry about, but we're still doing our site measurements, taking the longest measurement first, and then everything else is relative to that. So this house, it's a little bit wider than it is taller. So I'm just marking the height and the bottom of it so that I don't run off the page, and I want to keep my subject within there. And then the angles on the roof are the other measurement that I'm going to take. If you hold up your pencil when you're standing out there, you can see the angle and then translate that angle onto your page. And then when there's a house that has multiple stories, I also do some little cross sections dividing each story so that I make sure that I have enough room for all my windows. And every shape on here I'm making a little bit wiggly so it all has a little bit of extra character to it. Nothing is too straight or too stiff. And I just slightly exaggerate certain things too, and then it becomes a little bit animated. So I did all my fun little scribble drawing parts, and now I'm going to come in and define my marks and pick out the best lines. See how my roof has just that little bit of a curve and the chimneys kind of poke out a little bit to the side. I want everything to be a little bit wabi-sabi. All those little imperfections are what make it more interesting. You see, I'm not drawing in any little window panes or adding too much detail. What I'll do is just kind of color those things in with the darks. And the only things I actually erase are the parts that are just way off. So now time to ink it in. And I'm just going to make sure I have a nice, good sense of contrast here. And I'm just adding little bits of suggestions of the elements that are on the outside of the subject. I want to keep my focus on the subject, so I don't put a ton of detail in the outskirts. You want to let everything on the outsides just kind of fade off a little bit. And then I'll just kind of scratch in just a little bit of marks to get those textures in that thatched roof there. And you see I accidentally got my hand in some of the wet ink and smudged it a little bit on the side there, so whenever something like that happens, I just kind of turn it into an extra bush or a tree. But you do have to be really careful with all this wet ink. It's very easy to smudge. And at the end, before I put the watercolor on, I do a blot test. And I get a paper towel and push it on top of the ink areas and just make sure that I don't do any of the watercolor painting until the paper towel is totally clean with no ink. So you can see how much I'm coloring in these windows here. And like I said, I'm not doing every little window pane. I'm just coloring in the darks. And keeping openings where the where the sun is causing a glare on the window pane. You have a bit of a reflection there. If it's too thick and heavy, then it'll start to look like your house has a set of eyes. So you got to keep it broken up. There, now that smudge just turned into a little bush. And for the trees and foliage and leaves, I always just do little squiggly lines, and those scribble marks make excellent leaves and bushes. So here I'm putting in my pathway, and you can see I'm kind of getting some denser areas with the ink, kind of using that contrast and the heaviness to push you into the subject. So I just got to finish up this little fence and the bushes here, and then we can start adding the color. You can see with those dark windows and the darks going into the pathway to the door, I've got a really nice balance of darks and good sense of contrast here. All right, so for this one, I am not caring about reality at all. I'm not caring about where my lines are. I'm just going to throw some fun color on here and have a good time. The one thing that I will do though is still create a sense of balance with my color. So everything is all about the yin and the yang. If you got purples up here in the top and dark in the corner, then in the bottom corner on the other side, you'll probably want some more darks that match it. So everything always has a sense of balance. And also I'll tap on some extra little sprinkles. I want this to be really loose and wild and fun. And we always want to do everything and paint it just like it is. And it takes a while to be able to learn how to open yourself up to just be free to paint any color. And my house is purple and yellow and green, and none of it has to make any sense at all. It just has to be balanced. So now you can see how one half is kind of the warm colors and the other half is kind of the cool colors. And then I'm going to take that warm and put it down in the opposite corner, and now I've got some yin and some yang. And then I'll put some cool down on the other corner just to balance it out. And I'll start light and then just build up a little bit more intensity in the color here and there. Not too much. Not trying to prevent the ink from being able to be shown through. If I get too dark, I just add more water. And this paper I'm not on the really expensive 100% cotton paper. This is just some kind of generic mixed media paper. And so the water and the pigment sits on top of the paper, just kind of floats around on there, and you get all sorts of interesting, spontaneous things happening that way. For this painting, we don't need a ton of control. We want things to be wild and fun. And as it dries, it keeps transforming, and at the end, you have this wonderful little piece of art. And so that's pretty much it for this week. And then the next class, we're going to start diving into perspective.